April 22nd, 1889. Oklahoma District. Land the United States government confiscated from the Creek and Seminole Indians after the Civil War. Land that had been promised to them forever. Thousands of settlers are gathered here for the opportunity of a lifetime, a U.S. authorized land run, which allows each of them to claim 160 acres free. Many are boomers, advocates who've been clamoring to open up this area.
We had a term for them. They were Igananuksalgi, which meant land-hungry people. That was just our mindset when we saw someone coming. They were Igananuksalgi. They were coming here that you could see in their eyes that their only interest in us was to find a way to take our lands.
Fred Sutton, a boomer, writing about his land run experience.
As the clock pointed to noon on that memorable day, the cavalry patrolling the lines fired their carbines. A shout like a roar of a mighty storm broke on the air, and the greatest race ever staged was on.
I think it was a plague of locusts. I know the land was gone at that point. I know that it had been taken from us and was out of our hands before it was offered. But I still find it very hard to watch anything that celebrates that aspect of Oklahoma history.
This is the first of several Oklahoma land runs. Though they mark a new beginning for the settlers, they are a devastating and irretrievable loss for the Indians.
This is not only how the West was lost, but this is what happened to the losers.
(1846), Indian Territory, home of the Cherokees, the Muskogees, also called the Creeks, the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, and the Seminoles. Because of their education, their governments, and their churches, they will become known as the 5 civilized tribes. These 5 nations had lived in the southeastern United States for centuries. But in the 1830s, the U.S. rips them from their beloved homeland and opens it to white settlement. They are paid off with huge tracts of the western wilderness and forced to resettle there, far from white society, far from land-greedy Americans. This is land received in trade for their original homelands with no conditions. It is theirs forever.
We got a patent, a meets and bounds description for 14 million acres. Just like if you go out and buy yourself a house and you get a title and deed, we had the ultimate rights in that property without any interference, any governance, any supervision by the federal government. That was ours, no ifs, ands, or buts.
It was the same story, you know, as long as the waters ran, the grass grew, that this would be their lands. They gave up the abundance of Georgia and Alabama to come here.
Not only are the 5 tribes evicted from their homes, but each must make an unspeakably arduous journey to their new lands, along what would become trails of tears for each nation. Thousands die during these forced evacuations. Like the other nations, the Muskogees consider their suffering the price they must pay for freedom and independence.
It was a trade for which we paid in blood, probably with 5,000 or 6,000 lives lost on the trail from Alabama to the Indian Territory.
Within 12 to 15 years, by 1850, 1855, they had a civilization that far exceeded that which they had had in the East.
Many mixed bloods who have adopted white culture are as prosperous here as they were in their former homes, and they're not the only ones to benefit from the new land.
The most important thing was that it provided a kind of civilization in which the full blood who wished to remain, and all evidence indicates that he did, in a traditional kind of lifestyle, was able to have the land to do that.
By age-old custom, each of the nations holds their land in common. There is no individual land ownership. That is their way of life. But everyone is free to work as large a plot as he can handle for as long as he wishes. Pleasant Porter, Muskogee chief at the turn of the century, recalls the quality of life in Indian Territory.
In those days, they always raised enough to eat, and that was all we wanted. We had little farms, and we raised patches of corn and potatoes and poultry and pigs, horses and cattle, and the country was prosperous. In my early life, I don't know that I ever knew of an Indian family that were paupers.
The 1850s are a golden age for the 5 tribes. But there's a cloud on the eastern horizon, the threat of war between the North and South. The people of the 5 nations and their leaders are deeply divided.
They weren't sure exactly what was going to happen. This is an unknown quantity here. Are we going to have brother against brother in our own people? We've had brother against brother for years, and now we're going to have it again. It's the same thing as the removal process. We are being divided again through no fault of our own.
April 1861. Fort Sumter, South Carolina. The Civil War's first shots ring out. 2 months later, Confederate agent Albert Pike writes to John Ross, principal chief of the Cherokees, a man determined to keep his people out of the war. Pike tries to win him over with lavish promises.
I am empowered to guarantee the Cherokees the perpetual possession of the whole of their country. The Confederate States will also assume the payment of all monies due to the Cherokees by the United States under existing treaties.
Ross politely declines the offer, But there are powerful forces drawing all 5 tribes toward the Confederacy. For one thing, their wealthiest members have owned slaves for decades.
The whole economy of the 5 nations was oriented to the south. The flow of commerce was down the river valleys to the Mississippi and into New Orleans. The financial connections were all with the southern economic system.
While the South is courting the 5 tribes, the North seems to be abandoning them. In the summer of 1861, the United States pulls its soldiers out of Indian Territory and sends them to fight Confederate armies elsewhere.
And with those troops gone, the presence of the federal government was gone, and as a result, this helped convince many tribesmen that it was their best interest to join the Confederacy.
By now, Confederate troops, some recruited from the 5 tribes, are roaming Indian country, intimidating those favoring the North. John Ross reluctantly signs a treaty with the South. But many people of the 5 nations are still torn. Thousands favor the Union or neutrality. Whatever their sympathies, none can avoid being drawn into a war that will tear apart all of America. Summer 1861. Hostilities between North and South erupt into all-out war. Confederate troops march into Indian country, threatening pro-Union Indians. November 5th, 1861. Apothle-Yahola, a long-respected Creek leader, gathers some 10,000 Indians trying to stay clear of the Civil War, men, women, and children threatened by Southern troops, and leads them toward Kansas and the protection of the Union. They are not an army. They are refugees who fear for their lives, and they have reason to be afraid.
On their way north, they were attacked by Confederate forces out of Texas, and 3 different battles took place. The first 2, the Muskogee were able to drive off the Confederate forces, but they expended all their ammunition. And in the 3rd and final battle, they were defeated.
Among the troops who attack Apothle-Yahola's people are Indians who've sided with the South. For the Civil War has turned brother against brother within the 5 tribes, as well as the rest of the nation. Battered and disheartened, the survivors stagger toward the safety of Kansas.
They suffered drastically. They had practically no sort of clothing, whatsoever, and this plight was during the winter months, and the people died along the way.
While his people and Apothle-Yahola himself are dying in Kansas, the conflict in Indian Territory deteriorates into guerrilla warfare. In the Cherokee Nation, one of Chief Ross's bitterest enemies, Stand Watie, rises to the rank of general in the Confederate Army. Watie uses his men against tribal enemies, burning Ross's house and the Cherokee capital at Tahlequah. The losses are greatest for those who have little to begin with.
I remember one a woman saying her grandmother told her great-grandmother about coming home after the war, and there wasn't anything left but a chicken, and it didn't have any feathers. The Yankees burned everything. What they didn't burn, Stan Wadey burned.
The Five Nations will find it much harder to rebuild this time than when they first came to Indian Territory. Though only a portion of their people have sided with the South, they have given the U.S. a pretext to break the treaties that granted all of them their western lands forever.
No other Confederate-associated group of people were forced to surrender land, surrender sovereignty, and change their lifestyle. The American Civil War is something which in many respects the Indian Territory never quite recovers from.
In 1866, the U.S. forces the five tribes to sign treaties of cession and indemnity. Soon after, Chief John Ross dies, his 40-year struggle for his people's independence over at last. The treaties confiscate huge tracts of land from the Creeks and the Seminoles, and they give the U.S. control over an even larger area belonging to the Cherokees.
There were, of course, other provisions in those treaties that were imposed on the Five Nations immediately after the war. Clearly, they had to give up their slaves. In fact, they had to not only free the slaves, they had to make them citizens of their various nations.
The treaties also let railroads build lines directly across the five tribes' homelands, even though the U.S. had once pledged to keep white intruders out of Indian Territory. Over the years, because of these treaties, thousands of white outsiders overrun Indian Territory, and the five tribes have no control over any of them.
The outlaws, the marauders from the American Civil War, the poor, the homeless, the misfits, hid in the Cookson Hills and in the Indian Territory. And the Cherokees, because of the federal interference, could not prosecute those folks effectively.
Judge Isaac Parker, working out of Fort Smith, Arkansas, has jurisdiction over U.S. citizens in Indian Territory. He tries to keep crime in check, using a small army of deputy marshals to catch the worst of the offenders, outlaws like Jesse James and the Dalton Gang. He sentences so many to death, he becomes known as the hanging judge. He blames these criminals for many of the Indians' problems.
So you had people who wanted to come in and who did come in to steal the timber. You had railroads bringing across the country people whose goal was to rob and to steal.
The thieves enter Indian Territory as part of an overwhelming tide of white settlers. And these settlers, some invited by the Indians to become tenant farmers, prove even more dangerous than the thieves.
They, in fact, work for Indian people. And as more and more people began to take over the whole area and blocks of land with leases or rental of property and so forth, they were able to get a foothold, so to speak, in Indian Territory.
By 1880, whites outnumber Indians in Indian Territory, and they're demanding services from Washington, schools, courts, all the trappings of government. there is a rising clamor to declare the area U.S. territory, Oklahoma Territory. Oklahoma is a Choctaw term meaning red people. To the 5 tribes, declaring their land U.S. territory is the first step in taking it away from them. Meanwhile, the U.S. rounds up more than 50 other Indian nations from all over the country. It moves them onto land taken from the 5 tribes after the Civil War, turning it into a kind of Native American concentration camp. These Indians are the losers in the Western Indian Wars, or those removed from their homes in other parts of the United States. The Nez Perce, the Modocs, the Cheyennes, the Comanches, and the Kiowas, among others. But the final blow against the 5 tribes will come not from these Indians, nor from white intruders. It will come from the East, from a group of humanitarians who fervently believe they're acting in the Indians' best interests. (1885). A resort on Mohonk Lake, 50 miles north of New York City. Here, humanitarians meet yearly to debate the future of the Indians. One of their leaders is Massachusetts Senator Henry Dawes, chairman of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs.
Henry Dawes was a product of an Eastern establishment that had great sympathy for the Indians and was determined to see that justice was done to the Indians. The humanitarians, however, were far removed from actual experience with Indians.
Dawes and his friends think they understand the Indians. They are so certain of their beliefs that they are unable to see beyond their own culture. Senator Dawes.
They have got as far as they can go because they own their land in common. There is no enterprise to make their home any better than their neighbors. There is no selfishness, which is at the bottom of civilization. Till this people will consent to give up their lands and divide them among their citizens so each can own the land he cultivates, they will not make much more progress.
In fact, common land ownership is one of the 5 tribes' most deeply held convictions. It is a way of life. And it prevents whites from buying land of individual Indians and whittling away the tribal land base.
There's this excellent quotation is that they lack greed. What they need is individual ambition and individual drive and the desire of personal acquisition. And the way to do that, they said, was to break up communal land, which is held in common, parcel it out to individuals, and literally, in effect, tie pieces of meat around necks and let it become a dog-eat-dog world.
The humanitarians call for allotment, dividing the tribe's common land and giving it to individual Indians. That plays into the hands of the boomers, who are eager to break up tribal lands so they can buy pieces for themselves in the name of progress and profit. Exactly the same reason the 5 tribes had been evicted from their homes 50 years before.
This was greed. This was a complete disregard for any rights of the Indians, and in fact, in many instances, a feeling that the Indians weren't humans at all and had no humanity that needed to be respected.
An official of the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad.
What is the Indian of today? He has persisted in remaining a savage. He is a very lazy, and a very vicious man. We maintain that it is a right of humanity that this immense area of soil should be occupied and cultivated by an industrious people.
It's one of the great ironies, I think, of American history that you have in the center of the movement west a group of people, Indians who are thought to be savages, who in truth are higher educated, more economically sophisticated, and better off than those who are surrounding them.
With both the humanitarians and the land boomers behind him, Senator Dawes shepherds the General Allotment Act through Congress in 1887. Convinced the law will give whites a license to steal their land, the 5 tribes successfully lobby to get themselves exempted. Then they watch in horror as the U.S. applies the law to other tribes throughout America. The 5 tribes are alarmed when the lands of other tribes are allotted, sold off, and opened to white settlers. They fear that despite the treaties, despite the sacrifices, the tears, and the bloodshed, they're next. They fear that for the second time in 60 years, they will lose the land they have come to love. In 1890, the U.S. stops the Cherokees from leasing their westernmost lands to ranchers. The nation is forced to sell the area known as the Cherokee Outlet to the U.S. government for a pittance. And in 1893, this land, which had been promised to them forever, is lost to them forever. It becomes the bounty and the greatest land run in Oklahoma history.
Thousands of people line up in the Kansas border and just race down and stake their claim. Well, for some Cherokees, it could be no more than, or no less than personification of greed. Take from the Indians what you want and be proud about it.
In 1893, the U.S. goes after the 5 tribes again. It sends the Dawes Commission to prevail on them to accept allotment. With outsiders on their borders, intruders in their midst outnumbering them 2 to 1, and railroads crisscrossing their territory, the 5 tribes refused to even consider the idea.
To real Indian, it was hard to divide land. It was something that you had so much of it, the people lived in it, they shared it. And I think it's best said, as I heard an elder say one time about the Creek medicine and the land, it belongs to all of us. It was given to the Indian by God or the great Creator to help you. It's give here to help you.
For 5 years, the Dawes Commission tries to convince the civilized tribes to accept allotment, but the nations adamantly refuse. Congress finally loses patience with them and passes the Curtis Act. It is the legal blackmail the U.S. needs to force allotment on the 5 tribes.
In effect, they pulled a gun and cocked it and held it to the heads of the Indian nations. That gun was the Curtis Act. And in effect said, if you will not negotiate an agreement with us of your own free will, we shall apply this to you.
The Curtis Act not only compels the 5 tribes to accept allotment, it also dissolves the vaunted civilization of the 5 tribes.
Took away our courts, took away our taxation. It limited the powers of our government. It allotted our communal title. wadded the land. It took the heart and tried to take the soul of the Cherokees.
The Dawes Commission travels Indian territory, making a list of every Indian entitled to a plot of land. It's the first step in allotting the lands of the 5 tribes, a huge undertaking that will affect tens of thousands of people and take decades to complete. Many full-bloods view the process with scorn. Chito Harjo, a Muskogee whose name means crazy snake, persuades many full-bloods to stonewall the allotment process. He insists the old removal treaties are still in force. Chito Harjo and his followers remember the Trail of Tears, the price they paid for this land. Harjo recalls what Andrew Jackson said when he forced the Indians to give up their eastern homelands and move here.
He told me that as long as the sun shone, these agreements will be kept. He said, as long as the waters run, it shall last. As long as grass grows, it shall last. And not until all these things pass away shall our agreement pass away. That is what he said, and we believed it. We have kept every term of that agreement. The grass is growing, the waters run, the sun shines, and the agreement is with us yet. For the God that is above us all witnessed that agreement.
In 1905, members of the 5 tribes make one last-ditch effort to retain some political power.
The Sequoia Convention was an effort by leaders in the Indian Territory to create a separate state, to have a Sequoia, which would be the Indian state, and Oklahoma, which would be what was the Western, or Oklahoma Territory.
But the U.S. dismisses the Sequoia proposal with disdain, and it rolls over the resistance of full-bloods like Chito Harjo. For the 5 tribes, allotment becomes a terrible reality. And in many cases, the Indians' allotments are hardly worth having.
A lot of it was just rocks, trees on hillsides. In fact, one of my mother's 40 acres lies upside a mountain, no ingress or egress to it. It's just there. It was just holding the world together. It could not be used for anything.
Soon, the people of the 5 tribes have no land left except that allotted to them as individuals. And this land is also under assault from greedy conmen and land speculators. They use every imaginable scheme to get what they want, from the barely legal to the totally criminal. Collectively, these swindles are known as grafting. In the years ahead, grafting will decimate what's left of Native American land holdings in Indian Territory. In 1905, with Teddy Roosevelt in the White House and the U.S. becoming a world power, Oklahoma rushes pell-mell toward statehood. Whites are spreading over Indian country, building homes and towns, buying allotted land, picking the 5 tribes apart, plot by plot, turning grafting into a fine art.
It might include long-term leases running for as long as 99 years for as small as a sum of $5. It might include being appointed by a court a guardian of a minor's estate and then leasing that estate for $1 a year to your colleague, who then would lease it for several $100s and you would pocket the profit. It might include literally having an Indian sign a will deeding his allotment to you at the time of his death, and not long thereafter, Indians would start appearing dead.
Our last allotment agreement was signed in 1902, and by 1904, thousands of acres had already gone out of the hands of our citizens. A number of people were defrauded. A number of people were forced to sign deeds without realizing what they were doing.
The government does almost nothing to stop this massive thievery, partly because many officials are busy grabbing land for themselves. The result of all this grafting is that the 5 tribes lose just about everything. Eufaula Harjo, a Muskogee.
We are pushed out of all that we had. The full-blood Indian people have taken what they have and are camped out in the woods. It is going to be cold weather, and there is the women and the little children and the old people. We don't know what to do with them or where to get a house to put them in. All the cattle and hogs and horses, it is all gone. We used to have more than we wanted, and now we haven't got anything.
On November 16, 1907, Indian hopes for self-government come to a final, heart-wrenching end. On this day, Oklahoma becomes the 46th state in the Union. During the festivities, Oklahomans try to portray statehood as a friendly merger of Indian and white.
It's part of the ceremony, indeed the highlight of the ceremony. A young man dressed as a cowboy married a young lady dressed as an Indian princess, symbolizing the union of Oklahoma Territory, the West, with Indian Territory, the East, in this new state. I've always thought they symbolized more than they intended, because the so-called Indian princess was not Indian at all. She was not even mixed blood. She was all white. And the symbolism was that Indians will be used commercially and as symbols, but they don't really have a part to play, not as Indians in this state.
Nevertheless, the image of Indian and settler is immortalized on Oklahoma's Great Seal.
With Oklahoma statehood, the 5 nations lost more than land. They lost more than sovereignty. They lost a way of life. They lost a tradition. They lost major chunks of a culture. They lost a sense of identity.
The 5 tribes have kept their independence longer than any other Native Americans. But even they, with their civilized ways, have not convinced the United States to let them keep their land and govern themselves. The same is true of every other tribe, even those who fought U.S. armies almost to a standstill. America has proved itself unable to accept Indian independence. But no matter what the U.S. has done to the Indians, it has never been able to quench the Native American yearning for nationhood.
All girls, we're glad to have you here at Telephone, Oklahoma today, all the way from Cherokee, North Carolina.
September 1994. The Cherokee national holiday at Tahlequah, Oklahoma.
Mr. Skylar Terrapin, first runner-up in the Little Mr. Cherokee contest.
This annual event brings together not only Cherokees, but native peoples from all over Oklahoma and beyond. Even as the people celebrate and look to the future, they recall the past and the legacy of allotment. Wilma Mankiller, principal chief of the Cherokees, addressing her people.
Of all the things that happened to us at the turn of the century, the closing of our schools, stopping of our newspaper, the closing of the courthouses, the stopping of the tribal council, my feeling is that nothing had a greater impact on who we are as a people than the individual allotment of land. It forever changed the way we look at ourselves and our communities.
Within 20 years after the allotment process began, the Cherokees had lost 90% of their land. And today, the Cherokees only hold in restriction or in trust 1/3 of 1% of that original 7 million acres.
The story is the same for all of the 5 tribes. Precious few acres have remained in the hands of the Indians. But despite the catastrophic effects of allotment, the 5 tribes retain remarkable cultural vitality.
They would have destroyed us, I believe, if it hadn't been for the ceremonial people. The ceremonial people were the ones that kept the traditions alive. They were the ones that hung on to the old beliefs and the old ways of thinking.
A warm summer evening in Wetumpka, Oklahoma, in what was once a part of the Muskogee Nation. The family and friends of Thomas Yahola, a descendant of Apopla Yahola, come together. This sharing and sense of community are a vital and commonplace part of Native American family life in Oklahoma today.
The tribes survived. That is really the miracle of the whole experience, that those old Indian stories, the belief in the invincibility of the people, turned out to be true. Because at this moment, as we know, we have flourishing Indian tribes who are coming back with great strength and power and government.
Through their eyes, through their words, through their hearts.